I'm going to talk about this idea of designing culture. I'll make it a bit broader than just lean startup culture and just in quotes. Who of you was not at my talk this morning? So few. So I will just quickly show the tool, but since it's so simple, that'll be easy. But what I want to do first is just sketch out kind of the context of this last tool, the culture map, and also of all of the other tools, why this is relevant and why this can make our life easier. Now, we're a very great group, very experienced people from all different kinds of companies, a lot of experience with lean startups. So please also share. I'm going to get you to talk to each other and ask questions whenever you want. Okay, so you can interrupt me. I do a lot of stuff in the Netherlands. They will never ask to ask. They will just ask, so that's good. Okay. So just before I get to the slides, let me just show you kind of the context of what we're thinking about here. These tools around the lean startup movement, help us go from idea to this. Let's see if my visual thinking skills are good. Anybody know what this is? Don't insult me, please. Come on. This is an idea. This one you saw, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, it's a ship.
A factory.
Okay, thank you very much. This is a $1 billion business. I mean, did you see that? Clearly, right? Okay. Now a real one, not a unicorn. So the thing is that, traditionally, and I joked about this morning, to get from idea to business, we used to write business plans. And unfortunately, for those of you who work in large companies, who works in an existing or a company, 10,000 people or more? Okay, so I assume your company still asks for something like business plans. Wrongly so, because business plans are a waste of time for new ideas, for new things. The business plans are good for execution. But why don't they work for new ideas? It's very simple, because the journey of going from idea to business actually looks something like this. You advance, you regress. If you're a startup, you almost go bankrupt. You might have a nervous breakdown, and then eventually, because you learn about lean startup and these tools, you're going to get there. Okay, who's lived this journey? Okay, now, is a business plan going to help you through this journey? Absolutely not, right? So when we started out, our ambition was to kind of create tools, conceptual tools that help you with this. So we came up with the business model canvas, and I'm sure some of you use this. Then we came up with the value proposition canvas. So the business model canvas allows you to describe the story of how you create value for your business. That's the only goal of this particular tool. Then the value proposition canvas tells the story of how you're creating value for your customer. Different problem, different tool, right? It's like a surgeon is not going to use a Swiss Army knife to perform heart surgery. The surgeon is going to use several tools for different problems. Okay, and then we created one in the first book, which we call the environmental map. So it's kind of like zooming in, see this, and zooming out, okay? And they're all connected. It's like an API between the different tools. But as I said this morning, one of the issues is that on this journey here, during the search for the right business model and value proposition, you need a particular behavior. Eric called this a particular mindset. You need the right culture to actually do this experimentation, because, again, it's not linear. It's something that's a lot more cyclical, right? Which the lean startup movement would call build, measure, learn. So that's why we came up, together with Dave Gray, with this culture map. And I think the best entrepreneurs, the best innovators in existing companies will be people who operate like surgeons, because they're good at using these different types of tools, and they were trained to use them. But I actually do think it will make a huge difference. Entrepreneurship, strategy, innovation will become a lot more like a profession, like becoming a doctor or a surgeon, than anything else. Now, you're never going to take away the creativity that you need from human beings from the entrepreneur. Entrepreneur will always stay in art in that sense, but it's more like design, not art to make something look good, but designed to make something that has a purpose, right? So that's kind of the context that I wanted to use first, just to frame this conversation. Why we at Strategizer think these kind of conceptual tools, and ultimately after digital tools, because I think, you know, when you collaborate with a team, it's not enough to use paper and sticky notes, so you need to zoom in between these different aspects of business. But this is really something that's going to take off, and we hope to be part of it. Somebody's going to build this kind of SAP of strategy. Hopefully, we'll be able to contribute in this space. So now let me switch to culture, which I promised I would talk about. But we can also kind of open it up to questions in other spaces. So Dave was the person who did the heavy lifting here. He did all the conceptual research. It's almost like a little PhD that he did. And then we, together with Yves Pinier, my long-term co-author and strategizer, we tried to make these tools simple so we could create an innovation culture, a lean startup culture. Meaning, a culture where you can experiment, where you can fail or succeed, where you can learn, and then improve. So a lot more cyclical. Something, remember this morning I showed improve, invent? Something allows us to find new businesses. So why should we care about this? Not just because we're talking innovation culture, and here I'm going to open it up a bit broader for a second, because if you look at some of the statistics, people were not particularly engaged in their jobs in most of the companies around the world. This is just the US. If you take 10 people, 3 people in your company are likely to be engaged, 5 people out of those 10 are likely to not be engaged, and 2 people will actively disengage. Isn't that insane? Now, of course, you know, we're cool startups. We have a different ratio. This is, what could we take as the worst company? This is IBM, right? So, anybody from IBM? Oh my God, I just shot myself in the foot. But basically this means that, you know, people spend 90,000 hours of their lives doing something that they don't want to do at a place they don't want to be at. And this is a huge waste in terms of human capital. So we need to create these great workspaces. And I don't think startups are necessarily very good at turning this all into green, because we tend to sometimes squeeze, you know, the shit out of people and they turn red. So, as a Swiss, you know, I don't always know how to use the right English words. Slip every now and then. So that's a huge cost. I think it's an even bigger cost if you take that whole innovation piece to it, that large companies today can't innovate because they can't create this kind of engaging culture. So what we're going to look at is, you know, that's a desired culture. That's usually our actual culture. And what we want to close here is this gap between desired and actual culture. Now here's the funny thing. Before we started talking about this with Dave, people didn't realize that you could intentionally design culture. And it's damn hard if you remember this morning we had what is corporate culture. It's kind of hard when you don't define it, when you don't have a shared language. That's why I think we can get beyond this, where people aren't happy because of bonuses, because they can't innovate, because they can't do lean startup their culture. We can get beyond this if we have the right tools. We can narrow this gap, and we'll have a lot more happy people, and people who can innovate, and people who can create new growth engines as a startup or within large organizations. So the analogy I'd like to make here, and I do have to go a bit quicker so I can get you to work. After all, it's called a workshop. Now I'm the only one working. That's not good. So if you look at imaging technology, this is an image of the planet. Anybody recognize it? Kind of hard, right? Planet Pluto. Can't you see it? Planet Pluto, 1997. In 2015, technology progressed so much that we would have this kind of image. It's from this year. So in imaging technology, we made an amazing steps forward, and we could change things. Now, if we look at organizational design, we made some steps forward, but not enough, right? So I think we can do better, and that's where I do think tools are actually really important. You don't want your heart surgeon to use a Swiss Army knife, right? And you'd prefer if that heart surgeon was trained for more than 10 years. So why is it, when it comes to entrepreneurship and innovation and strategy, that we're not doing a better job? So I think this is one of my favorite quotes, actually. We're trying to solve today's problems with yesterday's tools. And that's a big issue. Now, I think, all of these things that are emerging, the lean startup movement, customer development, business model canvas, other tools, culture map now, those are helping us work in a more structured way. And actually the minimum outcome, which I was always surprised by, we believed in it, is this idea of having a shared language to make value propositions tangible, business models tangible, and what we're going to talk about, making cultures tangible. So what if we had better tools to design better companies? What does a great company look like? And here's where I'm just going to finish up with the tool idea. My very subjective opinion of a great company is, number one, it's a profit-spitting machine. Because if it's not going to survive for very long. I'm not saying you can be small, that's a choice, but great companies are usually, they can grow, they can create value for their business, but then they also should, if they want to be a great company, create value for their customers. They get customers excited. Now, banks would already fail at the second part because they're profit-spitting machines, but who has a bank that excites them? Anybody in the room? Okay, so few of you, okay? Now, the third one, this is already a lot less likely, and I think in the startup world we think we do better. We actually don't always. We also need to get employees excited, but not just about, hey, we're going to change the world, but also workplace happiness. Great place to work at, right incentive systems, etc. And then the fourth one I would add is great companies make the world a better place. And actually, if you create a better workplace, you probably already created a company that has an impact in the world, just by creating a better workplace and happier people. So first two, what you want to focus on. The third one is what we're going to look at today. But let's always keep one thing in mind. If you're a startup, before you get to culture, you probably want to perform well on the first two. So Ben has this great quote, the world is full of bankrupt companies with world-class cultures. Cultures don't make a company. But when we're in existing companies, here's the thing. When you have a bad culture, when you don't have an innovation culture, you can't do lean startup because there's so many blockers. Guess what? It's probably going to infect. It's like a virus, a negative virus infecting the first two. So corporate culture does become insanely important at a certain point, once you actually have a company that can stand on its own legs. So what if we had tools to do this? I showed this idea of the surgeon. You don't want to have heart surgery with a Swiss Army knife. You want people who are trained. Same thing for business tools. Okay? We want to move beyond this. So just let me finish on this idea of business tools. These are conceptual frameworks, but that are so practical that you can use them in everyday work. And that's one of the things that we try to do. We actually see business tools having a user interface, a user experience that make life easier for business people, startup to large company. So if we take these issues here, we have the business model canvas for the first one that helps us a bit, and I could mention other tools. You have the value proposition canvas for the second one, and the third one that we're going to look at and work with today is the culture map. Okay? And I think the culture map helps to a certain extent with the fourth one, but maybe there's a better tool for that specifically. So let's dive into this one, how to design an organizational culture. So we're going to look at the language, but then I'm going to make a link. This morning I said, maybe some of you heard it, said, okay, you have the tool, but you know what? You have to design an organizational culture, and here's where it gets fun. Maybe you can even test the things you're putting in place, just like we test products, services, business models. What if we could test aspects of our organizational culture? So instead of putting this, making this great document and saying we're going to design this great culture with these enablers and blockers, what if you tested those enablers and blockers first? So applying lean startup principles to the design of organizational culture. Follow me on this? That's pretty interesting, right? So what you're going to see now is how do you do this for organizational culture, but also how do you apply lean startup to these kind of things. So let's start with the tool. We already did this morning. It's define organizational culture. This is what you get. Very few people can tell you what it is. Now, it's not an exact science, so every definition is going to be made up. But if we have a better language, we can actually start mapping this. So here's a definition that you saw this morning. Values, beliefs, and behaviors practiced in an organization, and they evolve over time because we reward and punish certain behaviors. That is the essential part, the one at the bottom. Because the one at the top, that's an outcome. It's only the one at the bottom that you can actually actively influence. So when we came up with this tool, we did our own kind of lean startup process or lean process to get to the culture map. So for those who weren't here, I'll just run you through this, but without the example from this morning. The culture map consists of, and I'll ask you to maybe just hand these around, grab a sticky note and one culture map for each participant, and we're going to use it in a second, okay? So at the center we have the behavior. This is actually the culture. How do people behave in our company? Okay, so we'll have questions like, what do we do? What do we say? How do we behave? What are the things we do? What are the behavioral patterns? That's organizational culture. So maybe, can you just take half of it and throw it up there? Okay. So then you have the second piece here, which is the outcome of your organizational culture. If this is the way people behave, what is the result of that behavior? It might be political infighting, it might be lack of new growth engines because we can't do lean startup, all these kind of things. So these are the outcomes. This is what happens because of our behavior, okay? These are the results that we get. And then the last one is the one we're most interested in. This is the one we're going to work on in a second, is the bottom one. This is what you can design. Okay, this is what you really have under your control. The enablers, at least part of it, the enablers and the blockers. What enables a culture and what blocks a culture? That could be formal or informal, okay? So we have questions here, like what are the influencers? How do our leaders behave? What are incentive systems, and so on. So that's a tool, straightforward. Let me just see, who this morning thought that this is insanely simple, so simple that it feels simplistic? Who had that feeling? Right? Of course, that's why I'm almost embarrassed to present this. But here's the cool thing. You use this, and that's why I think tools are so important. You use this to facilitate a conversation. The conversation will be a lot more structured, and here's what's going to happen. People are going to put up these things, they're going to debate these things, and at the end you have a picture, a map of your existing organizational culture, or the culture you want to create. If you don't use a tool like this, here's what's going to happen. You'll have smart people sitting around the table, and what's going to happen? Blah, 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 blah. You'll be here, you'll be there, you'll blame people. It won't be structured enough, and you won't be able to actually design culture. So the simplicity is intentional to make it so easy that we can facilitate a conversation without stifling it, but that we have a real result, that we have a map afterwards. This. Okay, so this is our tool. I'll give you just an example of an enabler. Already, if you want to do visual thinking, like I just sketched something out, in your company you probably want to have places to do that. Here's the D-School. They have these portable boards. This will be digital one day. If you want to look at blockers, physical blockers, architecture, well, here's a good one. Do you think in this room anybody's going to do lean startup? Anybody's going to put up a business model canvas? Not going to happen, right? So even the physical space can be a blocker to behaviors. Okay, this is my favorite. Without wanting to diss any kind of place, I would guess this comes from South America, because I've been in these kind of workshop rooms. You can't even move around a chair, so how are you going to put up sticky notes, okay? So even the space has an impact on how we behave. Now what I want you to do, since it's a workshop, you got to work. Okay, and the Swiss always like to get others to do the work. So I want you to do something very simple. Individually, you take sticky notes. We did distribute those? Okay, great. If there's not enough, you split, you share. Okay? You identify 3 consistently bad outcomes, so that's at the top of your culture map, in your company. If you want, you can specifically tailor it to lean startup culture. If you want to keep it a bit more general, you just take 3 bad outcomes in your organization. Now some of you might ask, yeah, but you know, we're a startup of 2 people. This makes no sense. Culture starts from person 2. If you're a founding team of 2 or 3, you have an organizational culture. If you're hiring your first employee, you have an organizational culture. So any company beyond 1 person has organizational culture. And if you're just 1, I guess about 50% of those who are alone want to become bigger. Maybe 50% don't want to, but you want a certain kind of culture in your organization. So identify 3 bad outcomes. Then I want you to describe the behaviors that lead to those 3 bad outcomes. Why are those things happening? Yeah?
So isn't culture different in different pockets of the organization? So
yeah, I would keep it narrow, okay? So if you're GE, it's going to be pretty hard to start big, so you would take a small team. I think, you know, for this purpose, take a small team, okay? That's a lot easier just for us to learn. Afterwards, so Dave Gray did this a couple of times, he would do this mapping exercise with several teams and then see the patterns emerge, okay? So good, very good question. Then the third one is the most interesting. Once you've mapped out the behavior, then you really want to ask yourself, okay, why do we have this behavior? What enables this behavior here or blocks good behavior? Follow me on that? That could be because you don't follow my favorite hiring rule. Who of you has heard of Bob Sutton and his book called No Asshole Rule? Because if you don't follow that, you're likely going to have some, I shouldn't use that word, right? In the US, you have a very kind of interesting policy regarding words. So, it was funny, okay? The Swiss can be funny sometimes. When we make fun of others, sorry for that. So, you want to put all the enablers or blockers down there in the bottom block, okay? So, can we do this exercise for about, let's say 3 minutes, 4 minutes. I want you individually to sketch out your organizational culture. 3 bad outcomes, the behaviors that lead to those outcomes, and then the enablers or blockers that are the explanation for that behavior. Okay, let's go. Anybody who's not doing this exercise is visibly demonstrating a lack of interest for other people in their company. They don't give a shit about culture. Okay? So let's go and do it because we all want to create a great workplace. Let's continue together. So I'm just going to show you very briefly. Now I'm going to broaden it a bit. So some of the things that we did at our company to create a better culture, and we have Nabila there. Can you put your hand up, Nabila? Nabila is part of our content team, so if I'm lying, you can ask her. So Dave actually used this a lot more. Dave Gray was at the beginning of this in a lot of companies. I used it mainly with Strategizer and a little bit in some companies. But so one of the things that is important for us is we do want, you know, a happy team. We want to have more green. We don't want to have 7 disengaged or actively disengaging team members. It's just not a good thing because the outcome will be employee turnover. So we try to get that down by creating a team that has fun to work together. So some of the behaviors that the founders that we expect from ourselves, so we're now 2 founders, we want to collect happiness data. We want to just understand constantly, is the team happy or not? We want to ask how we can improve. And of course, that's not enough. We need to act on the feedback. So that's the behavior we expect from us founders, from ourselves. So we did this together with the founders. So here is what we use as enablers and try to eliminate the blockers. So we use Tiny Pulse surveys. I'll show you what this is in a second. Tiny Pulse is an online tool. And on that tool, it does a weekly kind of poll with one question every employee should answer. So one thing we ask once per month is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you at work? And it's completely anonymous, okay? So we would see, you know, how happy people are. Now that person over there is not happy on the left-hand side. That's a scale from 1 to 10. Now funny enough, that person then wrote an email, wrote in the comments, I'm actually very happy I'm at a 10. I'm just joking. But what is not very cool, and this was something that we weren't happy about, is here. You know, this is what is this? 10, 9, 8, 7. We had a 6 and a 5. That's just not good enough. So we try to figure out how we could change that, and we use this as an indicator. So we were able to move the needle and kind of get rid of those on the left, not get rid by firing them because we didn't know who they were. Wrong wording again. But getting rid of unhappy people in the sense that we needed to change some things to make people happier. So there's another question that we ask to kind of investigate the same thing. Is on a scale of 1 to 10, how enthusiastically would you reapply for a job here? So slightly different wording, but working towards the same kind of sense. So we follow that with tiny quotes. Again, completely anonymous. So we put that little thing in place because it would enable us to understand if people are happy. Here's another thing we do as an enabler of a happy team, is we do this black hat, yellow hat exercise. It's actually my favorite. So we're very distributed. We're 20 people, but all over the world. So we have this monthly call, and every now and then we would ask, okay, what are all the things you don't like at Strategizer? You hate. And everybody, for about 60 seconds, would in the chat window, vomit out everything they hate. And we would have this wonderful list, and black hat comes from the 6 thinking hats of De Bono. They would put on their black hat and say everything that sucks at our company. Now this is not anonymous, so there's a bit more risk involved, but we don't have a tendency to fire people because they put on their black hats. But we would get the things that they don't like. And then we would ask them to put on their yellow hat, metaphorically speaking, and ask them, what are all the things you love at Strategizer? And then for 60 seconds, they would put those things there. So we could emphasize that and do more around those kind of things. So it's an indicator for us. You can do the same thing, specifically targeted to creating a lean startup culture, targeted towards making decisions based on evidence, not opinion. So you need to put these kind of enablers in place. Then we had a Strategizer ideas board. Clearly didn't work because nobody puts ideas there, and it's kind of a graveyard of ideas. So that doesn't work. But one thing that we try to do a bit more, also a bit of a challenge sometimes, is these coffee chats to continuously talk to people. So a very simple way to just talk about culture. Then of course we need to act on that feedback. So we do this, now this is our product team that did this at a workshop. We recently did it in the mountains, in the Swiss mountains with the entire team. We brought everybody to Switzerland, and one exercise was the culture map. And we tried to actually figure out how do we create a better organizational culture. And the founding team actually also asks ourselves, as a small team, we have a culture map for ourselves to try to create a lean startup culture where we don't act based on opinion, but act based on evidence, on experiments. You need to put that in place even as a small founding team. So what I want you to do now is very quickly present your culture map, your organizational culture, to your seat neighbor. So very briefly, let's say 30 seconds, 60 seconds, present your culture, the bad things about your culture, to your seat neighbor, okay? So maybe if you're embarrassed, you don't say which company you're at. So let's go, okay? Let's continue. So, always amazed that I still have some authority after 36 minutes that you're listening to. Is the AV person here, by any chance? No? Okay, I wanted to show a funny video, but we won't be able to do that. Shouldn't have told you, right? So, what the point is of this exercise is that you facilitate a conversation with a group of people at your company to map the as-is culture. So this is a facilitation tool, and of course, if you don't have the buy-in of the leadership to actually do this, it's not going to go very far. So when you do this, you obviously need the leadership that buys into this, and you need to create a safe space where you do believe that people are going to talk about the real behavior at the company and what actually influences, blocks certain behaviors, okay? So you do this as-is thing, and then, which helps you with the difficult conversations, and then you go towards a to-be culture. Now here I had this great video from, you probably know The Office, you know that? Okay? So there's an alternative to using these sophisticated tools to design culture by applying this stuff from The Office, but I don't have sound, so we're not going to do this one, okay? But it's pretty impressive, and it's the contrary of a surgical approach, okay? So these are tools that help us better design organizational culture. And the thing that, just a side remark, because I'm pretty obsessed by tools, strategize, we're pretty obsessed by good tools. Quick side remark, what makes good, why tools are adopted. So you can actually make your own tools based on what I'm just going to tell you. Quick parenthesis. We were curious about, why do millions of people use the business model canvas? What's the reason? We weren't the first to talk about business models. So what we did is we did a little bit of research and figured out what it is. So number one, and this is one that we really underestimated. We believed in it, but we underestimated it. And this is really what we see now with the culture map. The visual aspect of it, making it tangible, not having people just blah, blah, blah around the table, but actually putting it on a wall, making that tangible with sticky notes, what the culture is, what the drivers of that culture is, that made a big difference. So we learned that from the business model canvas. The other aspect here was the business model canvas, and I think it's the same, I'll get to you in a second, the same with the culture map, is that it facilitates a conversation. Facilitates a conversation that is harder to have, not impossible of course, this is not new to talk about this kind of stuff, but it's harder to have when you don't have a tool that facilitates the conversation. And then was this one. It has a practical and simple user interface. So, we spend a lot of time and energy to design websites. Why the heck don't we design business tools? Wouldn't that make sense? To make them practical and easy to use? So you got to spend time with that, and they need to be intuitive. I didn't even say about conceptually correct, because I see some tools out there that are really conceptual disaster. So they need to be intuitive. You had a question over there. Something.
Yeah, you mentioned the visual impact of the tool, which I've noticed again and again.
Yeah.
But you have an online version of the tool, which
is visual.
Is visual, but how
it's visual.
You showed.
Yeah. Isn't it?
People hide it in digital drawers that don't get looked at as often.
Yeah, no, so sure, but you have that with the paper as well. So digital or paper is not going to make, it can disappear. But here's the thing, that people always say it's either physical, and they say, Post-it notes, we need to come together, do a workshop, or it's digital. Well, why not both? Why not use the best of both worlds, depending on what you're doing? So I think it's great to fly in people, if you're a distributed team, to do a workshop, put a Post-it notes on culture or business models. But guess what? Those people, many teams are either going to go in different corners of the city, or in the companies I work with, they go in different corners of the world. So you need a digital tool to collaborate. Then there are things you can't do on paper, like zoom in from the business model environment into the business model canvas, into the value proposition, look at the evidence that you have for each piece of your business model. Those are the things you can't do on paper. So what you want to ask is, when do you use paper? When do you use digital? It's not either or, it's and. Okay? I'll let some other questions. We can talk during the break. Okay? So I don't want one person just.
It's actually more of an observation. So I teach business model canvas workshops or how to use it. And I've found that it's, if you put it on the wall, or if you put the business model canvas on a table, it's not as effective as actually if you put it on the wall.
Absolutely.
And I don't know why that is, but that seems to be the case.
So my hypothesis is, because I don't have the evidence, I didn't do research on it, is because when you put it on the wall, number one, everybody has to stand. This is number one, you want that. So when you do a workshop around business models, value propositions, or culture, take away the chairs. Because you create a completely different energy. And then everybody can see it. It's on the wall. You're more than two people, it needs to be on the wall. Okay, it creates a different dynamics. And of course, this is not a dogmatic rule, but those are the things. Somebody else had one comment at the front? Okay, great. So, business tools. There we go. We actually even tried to work on the shape just recently in Boston. I think we overdid it a little bit. So we are probably going to stick to something like we have today. but for every business tool, we try to have some differentiation so people can recognize it. So, time is flying. Let's get to design. So why do we need to design organizational culture? Because we want to be, use lean startup culture, or because we want to have engaged employees. So this is really, it's a quote I like a lot that Paul Kenny came up with that I showed this morning. It's like wireframing a website. You can wireframe your culture. So you don't know if it's going to work. There are different cultures you could put in place. So let's prototype it. Let's wireframe it. Here's one example of a company that wanted to go from a as-is to a to-be culture. I picked this up at the Business of Software conference. A company called Bullhorn, and they were growing like crazy. And because they were so focused on growth, they didn't give, there's no other way to say it, they didn't give a shit about customer satisfaction. They were so focused on growth. But at one point, it actually skipped and customers were really getting unhappy, so they had to redesign their culture. So what they did is they said, what's the behavior we desire, the to-be culture? We want everybody to live these new core values of creating happy customers. And to do that, we're going to add these core values to the review of every employee. And maybe you remember that Eric said this yesterday, I think, in one presentation, that at GE, to really create a lean startup culture, this had to be in the performance reviews. Because things that don't make it into the performance review, that don't make it into the job description, guess what? People are not going to do it. Only the fanatics and those that are excited, us, for example, but the large majority is not going to live this, so you really need to change the culture. So they changed the incentives as well, designed to create a better customer culture. They were really tough, they got rid of non-believers who didn't want to focus on, because this was a company that was focused on growth. They fired those people who said, we're not going to switch from growth to better customer satisfaction. So ultimately, they created a different type of company. They redesigned their organizational culture. Pretty interesting. Now, some other examples, but what I'm more interested in is getting you to work. Called it a workshop. So what I want you to do now is, all of you should have come up with at least one problematic outcome, right? That was at least the assignment. I don't know how many of you did it. I want you now to ask yourself, what enabler could you put in place to change that negative behavior that you described, that undesired behavior that you had? Come up with a couple of enablers that can transform that previously described culture. Like redesigning the incentive system. That would be one enabler, right? Or firing all the people that don't live our company core values. That's another enabler. Eliminating the blockers, okay? So I'll give you exactly 35 seconds on your Rolex, maybe a minute, to come up with a couple of enablers. So you're going to fill out this bottom box of your value proposition canvas. Just think of what you could do to create a desired culture, changing the one you had. Okay, let's go. Come up with one or two. Okay, everybody have at least one enabler? Who doesn't? Great, okay. Because we're going to need this because we're all lean startup practitioners, so we're actually going to test that new enabler, okay, in a second. So, now, very briefly, I want you to pitch to your seat neighbor how you're going to change your organizational culture. So very quickly, one person says to the other, and then the other person says to the first one. Is that clear? Okay, I'll give you 30 seconds. Explain to your seat neighbor how you're going to change your organizational culture. Let's go. Very briefly. Okay, so now, before even testing this, before you would test this now not with the market like you would do when you're testing your product or your technology, you would test it with employees, right? If you want to, use the Lean Startup principles for your organizational culture design. But the first thing you want to do, even before going out and testing with employees, you might want to do this cool black hat and yellow hat exercise. So what I could have got you to do is one person, so what's your name?
Damien.
You were presenting to?
Megan.
Megan. So I could have said, okay, Now, Megan, you were listening to how he's going to change organizational culture. He talked about the enablers or the blockers he's going to take away. I could have asked you, this is actually a cool exercise, I could have asked you to put on, metaphorically speaking, a black hat and to tell him why this is never going to work. And if you actually do this, you're a team of 10, everybody puts on their black hat and everybody says why this is not going to work, you already have a good idea of how you could evolve your design and maybe make it better. Of course, you would want everybody to put on the yellow hat as well and say why this is going to work. This is actually a very effective exercise before you go out and test, because this doesn't give us any proof, but it does stress test the design. So before, and this goes for value propositions and business models just as much, before you test in the market, maybe you want to think of the design, because there are business models that are crappy even without the customer feedback. You can design better business models, okay? So you can apply this very effective way to quickly improve your prototype before you go and test. So at the conference, we learned about how to test products, services, business models, but now, why don't we test our ideas to change organizational culture? Because you might say, okay, I'm going to change the incentive system, that's going to work. Well, who are you to know? Right? It's an assumption. It's a hypothesis. So you should go and test it. I'll give you one example where they also had some assumptions, and it really backfired. So anybody heard of the Microsoft stack ranking? Okay? This is famous. So this was before the owner of the LA Clippers left. So what they wanted to do at Microsoft, I don't think they have this anymore. They wanted better performance, okay? So what they said is, we're going to introduce this stack ranking system. So what is stack ranking about? We're going to declare, if a team works together, we're going to declare a certain percentage of employees as top performers, good performers, average, below average, or poor. So, bring us a team of stars together, star developers, star marketers. Inevitably, with this system, some are going to be evaluated as poor, okay? Now, what do you think that led to? So the superstars didn't want to work in the same teams anymore, because inevitably, some of the superstar people would be ranked as poor, which would have an impact on their income, etc. So what started was this whole, political horse trading and a focus on posturing rather than actually getting the work done. And guess what? The performance actually decreased. So the assumption was we introduced stack ranking, it's going to increase performance. The reality was it created exactly the contrary, because they didn't test their hypothesis. So they had a culture of fear, and it created a lot of bureaucracy before they got rid of this. So it's the same thing. Like with a product, a technology, a business model, what you're designing is based on assumptions. Whatever you want to design, you should test it. Same for organizational culture. So if you want to move this, you better do something about it. So just very quickly, because I want to introduce the testing now. So let's assume you want to boost productivity in your company. Okay? There are these great products. Anybody remember how this is called? Some kind of sleep bag or so? The ostrich, right? It's a real product. Right? I'm surprised that this company still lives, right? Wow. Our CTO actually has one of those. So, okay, the assumption is we're going to increase productivity at our company if we have this new behavior that people are going to take naps, when they touch the limits. Very important in startups, but even in large companies. So what we're going to do to enable this is we're going to install sleep pods, and you know what? The boss is going to nap visibly 3 times a week. Isn't that awesome? Okay. So, but here's the thing. You want to test it. So we created this tool called test cards. You can Google test card and download it. This is something we came up with because we did lean startup. We weren't very good at it. So we had to create a tool for ourselves to create better behaviors. So we came up with this test card that would structure our experiments. So first one was the hypothesis. we believe that employees will nap more if the boss visibly naps 3 times a week. That's an assumption. That's our hypothesis, right? That's what we think will happen. Then, and you can do this for products and business models the same way, then you want to verify, you want to experiment, you want to test. So we're going to watch, so our experiment, if the team uses the pods, and what we're going to measure is the number of people who nap every day. So I'm keeping it simple just for illustration purposes. And then, of course, you need a threshold. We believe this was right if 30% of the team naps at least 2 times a week. Now, we didn't test the productivity here, as you can see. We just tested if they nap. So we might have to add another experiment. But this is the hypothesis that if they don't nap, there's not even a way to measure if they're productive. Okay, so you take the test card, you design your experiment. Same for products, technologies, and business models. But I think it's pretty exciting that we could do this for organizational design to create a better culture. So rather than designing this monster that we think is going to create a better culture, what if we tested the assumptions underlying our belief? And what I showed this morning is that, okay, you have an organizational culture, you probably have to evolve that organizational culture depending on the phase of your company. If you're a startup, from small to testing to scaling. And if you're a big company, you probably have to create that invent part besides the execution part, because otherwise you're going to become a disposable company. So I showed this picture here. So the big challenge for most companies is to create this kind of culture. So I would suggest that companies start designing intentionally the culture over there by working on the enablers and eliminating blockers, but maybe also testing these things, because we're at the very beginning of creating these new kinds of ambidextrous organizations. Okay, execution culture, and to be the wireframing of the search culture that we want to create. So that was kind of the essence of my talk. I got you to work a little bit. Is it fair to say it was a workshop? You think so? You fall in the workshop category? Okay, great. I'm not going to ask if the Swiss are funny. I'm a bit afraid of that assumption. But I'll show you a last example where a company actually tried to create more of an innovation culture. Singtel, some of you might have heard of it. This is the state operator in Singapore, the telecom company. They tried to create this kind of innovation culture. Now, the problem with innovation is that it's not sexy. So this morning I said, well, going into innovation in a large company is often, in many large companies, is career suicide. Okay? It's also not sexy because what gives you prestige in a large company? What gives you prestige? Scale, right? Budget and number of people. Now, if we follow the Lean Startup principles, does innovation require a lot of people and a lot of money? No, at least at the starting point it doesn't, so it's not sexy. So it's not a career path. And they had this at Singtel. So what they actually did is one enabler to make innovation sexy again is they took the number 5 of the company, they stripped him from all resources and all titles and said, you now go ahead and innovate. So they actually made it sexy because they took a very prestigious person who had a track record in the company and got that person to build an entirely new growth engine. But here's the risk. There's a risk with this. Have you heard of I'll stop with this one. Have you heard of the Michael Jordan syndrome in innovation? No? So Scott Anthony, one of my favorite thinkers and innovators, works for a company called Innosight, consulting company of Craig Christensen. He says, well, there's this Michael Jordan syndrome. Michael Jordan was a great basketball player, probably the best ever, okay? Now, he tried to become a baseball player. Now, he was probably better than most of us, but he was not a world-class baseball player. He was a world-class basketball player, the best probably, but not a world-class baseball player. The same goes for world-class executors. It's unlikely that some of the people who really execute well in a multi-billion-dollar business are good entrepreneurs or intrapreneurs or innovators. It's pretty rare, and of course we all have 1 or 2 people in mind who can do both really well. but they often do because they have a team. So what I think, would be an interesting thing, I mentioned it this morning, is if over here we had the CEO, the chief executioner, and over here we have the chief entrepreneur, and they have equal weight in the company, so we give innovation, lean startup, some real legitimacy in the company. We make it sexy, we make it powerful. Now, of course, people are going to push back and say you can't have two people at the same level, blah, 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 for thinking purposes, but we need to give power to innovation again. So, it's 3 o'clock on your Rolex, and I'll take some questions. Those who have to leave can leave, okay? So thank you very much for your attention.